Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Brooklyn Research, for inviting me to come here. And it was great to hear all the presenters. So my name is Yuliya Lanina, and I'm a multimedia artist. I do a variety of things, but here I would like to specifically talk about a few of the projects that relate to the piece that I'm performing during Creative Tech Week. And I will be performing on Monday, actually, if you're around, at 5 Mile Gallery in the evening at 7. And my piece is the combination of projected animation, interactive sound, and movement. And I'm a studio artist that now perform with my work. So it's not something I've been doing all my life, but this is the second time I'm doing it. And I'll show you a trailer of the piece so you can see what it is. Can we make it a little louder? You can see that there is a lot of painting involved in my work. So I am originally a painter, and so all of my animation is based on the paintings that I do, and then I animate in anime and also After Effects. And so you can see, how some of these paintings then make themselves into the animation, and it's really fun to kind of make the painting and then see what happens to it. And when I create paintings, I think of them as the finished work, but then I also know that they will have a life afterwards, and it's really interesting to see then what happens to them, and especially how they relate to me, how these characters that I create and relate to me. So this piece I started working on the piece shortly after election, and I felt overwhelmed like most of the people. And I felt that the best way to describe how I was feeling is kind of the combination of white noise and just, this kind of visual noise as well. And so I thought instead of, trying to kind of avoid that, to go and to see what's in there. So the beginning of the piece is very much about trying to see what's inside of that space of being kind of overwhelmed, having too many thoughts and feelings at the same time. So at the same time, I also started doing quite some doodling kind of myself, sort of getting to the same idea of, to seeing what it is that's behind this kind of overwhelmed feeling. And some of these doodles also made it into my animation that I then projected. So I'm not going to give the whole performance away. It's 20 minutes long. But in you know, in that piece, I sort of meet my alter ego that then brings me into this world that is still noise, but now it's made out of words, which is more understandable and still filled with anxiety, but probably more manageable than before. So this is my second time when I put myself inside of my animation. And the first time I performed last year during Creative Tech Week. And that piece, well, I should actually go back, and I work with, I always work with a composer, and for the performances I start working with choreographer too, because it's impossible for me to see what I, you know, look like being inside of the piece, so I need someone else to kind of help me along with the movements. And as far as working with composers, there's a really nice collaboration where I feel like both of us are telling a story in our way. I provide the visuals first and sort of, you know, describe what the piece is about, and then I let my collaborator really take it and interpret it however they want, with, you know, the idea that they will put some cues for me to know what's happening behind me, so I can know, you know, what to do. But it's really open-ended, and so it's really interesting to see how every time I collaborate, my work gets interpreted in a way that is really something I would never envision, but it's just enriching the piece immensely. And so for the previous piece, I worked with Russell Pinkston as a composer and Andrea Ariel as a choreographer. And for this piece, I worked with Vladimir Ranev as a composer, and this piece was very much about creation, creation and destruction and motherhood. I'm a mom, and so that sort of made its way into the piece. And I'll show you a trailer for that. So, and both of these pieces using also interactive sound. So in the first piece, when I make a motion of writing, there's a motion tracking device that then translates that into this kind of scribbling sounds combined with whisper. And for this piece, for the second piece, as I'm breathing, it triggers the voices of my children trying to make sense of what this whole thing is about, which was actually quite comforting for some reason, to be on the stage for the first time. And then hearing my children, it was kind of like this reverse psychology. Anyway, so again, you know, a lot of painting, and I'll show you how some of these paintings appear in the animation. And some, you know, they're all different sizes from 19 by 24 to 30 by 30. And it's really great to work with scale. You know, obviously you can make them however large or small. So, as I said, you know, I started as a studio artist, kind of making my way into performance, and as far as working with animation, I've been working with animations for some time, really trying to find a way for the paintings to not be static, but to move and to create another kind of story. And I'm very interested in the music as well, because I trained as a musician when I'm originally from Russia, and that's where I thought I was going to be a musician, turned out to be an artist. And I've done various collaborations with performers where they would be performing alongside the animation, and this time, you know, the performers and the animation were telling kind of parallel story. And I'll show you a little clip of one of the animations just for you to see what the animations look on their own. So that was much slower pace animation because that was based on the music by Messiaen, whose music is very melodical and slow, kind of meditative, and is very much about the way birds communicate. So I also, worked with dancers before, where the projected animation would be, you know, the backdrop or a set, part of the set, and sort of telling the additional, you know, story that was not being told by the dancers. And that's where I started working with animation as a part of the performance. And another part of my practice is making animatronics. So I've been making these dolls that I would find and take them apart and put them together and make them move. So for example, this little guy was smoking and drinking and twitching at his legs and laughing. I was really into this, I don't know if you've seen this kind of laughing boxes that are in the dolls. A lot of dolls have that it's this hysterical laughter. Anyway, that was before I had kids, by the way, so there's no influence there. Probably for good reason. Anyway, so I would find, all these different dolls, and I would reappropriate them and turn them into things that make sense to me. And add distance sensor on it, because I really like this kind of one-on-one interaction. So the piece will move only when someone is standing in front of it, so you don't have to turn on this manually on and off. And then making more complicated stages where, again, when a viewer is in front of it, there's this mini theatrical performance going on. And I would make the stages kind of inside of a female body, so this idea of a body being a storyteller. Not the head, but the body. And then these things became actors in the films. And I'll show you a snippet of one of the films, so you can see how also these dolls move and how they act in the film.
Какие люди, вы тоже сюда пришли. Прекрасное представление. Все такие чудные, такие симпатичные.
Anyway, oops. So actually for that film, I did a lot of voiceovers. So that brings me to something I've been working on last couple of months. So I decided, especially because I've been doing performance work, to bring myself into this animatronics that I've been making. And so what you see here is actually half of my face duplicated. So I don't know if you ever tried it, but all of us have asymmetrical faces. So if you split your face in half and put your half together, there'll be two completely different people you would not recognize. So it's kind of strange. So this is half of my face duplicated, and I 3D printed it, and I turned myself into kind of animatron. Slightly different haircut, but I did have my head shaved for a while, so it's not too far out. This animatron, so again, there's a hidden this time distance sensor. When you come close, you'll start sort of moving, and will have a heart like blinking red, so it's like as if it's beating. And it has a supportive character, this bunny that plays violin. Again, once you come next to it, the whole thing gets activated. This piece was actually shown during South by Interactive. And my husband is a composer, so he wrote the piece for this bunny He's a classical composer. Was a bit of a stretch for him, but I think it worked out really well. I'll show you what the bunny does. Oh no, hold on. How's it supposed to? Oh, me. Oh, here anyway, so it plays for like 30 seconds and it stops. And so what I'm doing now is I'm actually merging those two things together, and I'm working in a piece where I turn myself into one of those characters, and I'm using projection, but also using the animatronics to perform with me. So it's kind of like a shared pressure in some way. So that's my current piece, and I also want to play with the shadow, because that becomes really interesting. And that's it for my presentation. Any questions?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
I'll take this.
Hi. Hello? Is this on? Oh, yeah. So it's interesting that your performance work is kind of almost like very pure in a way, and then your animatronics work is like more on the dark end. Can you talk about that?
My performance is pure, and
Well,
I'm not sure I'm, yeah. But
it just seems like the performance,
Mhm.
the visuals, there's like a very childlike quality to them. That's like very beautiful, very pure. And then with the animatronics, it's really like about sexuality, a lot of these like, and especially the colors that you use. So I'm just wondering what you think about when you work between the mediums.
yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't show you all of the performance, images from the performances. The first piece I did shortly after I had kids, so I think there's a certain lightness there because of it. I think there was just not enough time in my day to think about the dark stuff. Now as the kids get older, I have more time to think about that, so the images start getting darker. But I also really want to involve my kids in my performance, because I think it would be the creepiest thing to have these little kids in these costumes. Anyway. There's 6. I have 6-year-old twins. So I don't know, I don't know if necessarily the images are that different, honestly. Maybe there were certain things that I was exploring with the dolls, that there was more reference directly to sexuality, but I think it's there still. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure they're that different, but maybe you see that differently than I do, So, I'm sorry, I think I didn't answer your question.
Hi. Thank you for presenting. I think your art's really important, and I like how I can see it transfer through the mediums. I was going to ask where your inspirations come from, because I see a lot of darkness, and I want you to talk about that.
Yeah, I think the inspiration just, it comes from life, essentially. As I said, I was thinking I was going to be a musician, and then I immigrated when I was 16 to United States on my own, and so it was a really tricky time in my life, and I started drawing then, and I think a lot of just things that were happening, and painting and drawing and, you know, whatever other things I do became my way of sort of processing what's happening and making sense of things and kind of, yeah, making sense of things in some way. And that's where a lot of my inspiration comes from, just sort of either doodling or, you know, taking a bunch of collages, cutting them up, putting them together, dolls, you know, whatever. But I feel it's just something that I cannot not do. And so it's my way of speaking in some way. And, you know, I think also a lot of inspiration in some way comes from Russian animation, which is so rich, and I grew up on it. And I think that, you know, there are so many anthropomorphized characters that would kind of be speaking political statements, but in a way that, you know, it would not get up there. So in some way, maybe that is also a big influence, just because that's what I grew up on. And also like really dark stories and fairy tales and, you know, and in general, you know, Russian kind of culture is pretty dark, you know, the main character dies, things, this sort of thing. So I mean, there's a lot of that influence there too.
So I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
I have a few questions.
Sure.
Since you mentioned right now the political statements, what were the main statements that you that you made through your animations and through your performances? That's my first question. And second, what are the techniques that you're using to kind of make your paintings live? How do you animate them?
Well, I'll start with the second. See, it's Adobe Suite, essentially. And I animate them. So, you know, I kind of look at my paintings as sort of the source material, right? And I cut it up, and I can make whatever I want out of it. And then I put it all together, and I use either Anime or After Effects. And they seem to do the job for now. I mean, as something more interesting comes along, I will use that. And as far as, you know, I don't really make like political statements in a way that, you know, maybe that was necessary as far as like Russian political statements, right? You know, when we had to. But in some way, especially, you know, I feel like personal kind of becomes not so much even political, but like universal, right? So if I really talk about myself in a way that, and I feel like I talk about myself pretty openly in my visuals, right? That in some way it becomes universal, and it gets to people, you know, people can really relate to what are the, you know, the things that I'm exploring in my work. And it doesn't have to be something, you know, specific. Sometimes it's more specific, sometimes it's less. But I hope that, yeah, I hope that the, you know, the things that I'm discussing kind of come across, essentially. And yeah, and I think, you know, as I said, you know, when art became this way of communicating to me, especially when I really couldn't, you know, English was not my first language, and I didn't really understand what people were saying. And I started relying on the visuals as my way to communicate, and I feel like it still kind of remains that way, even though I learned to speak English more or less. So, any other questions?
Really quickly, so you said for the current thing, or one of the current ones, you're working with like interactive audio.
Yes.
I wanted to ask sort of like, what's that process been like, and what does that like afford you as a performer?
Yeah, so, you know, composers work with other tools, right? With Max MSP and Jitter. Actually, I don't like Jitter at all, so we're not using Jitter anymore. It is jittery. It's like it's, I like it's, you know, smooth imagery. Anyway, But what's great, about using this method is that I can create, again, this like what performance does, right? It's creating this something in the moment, right? When the audience is there, it's this experience that only happens when we are all in the same room. And it can only happen then, no matter how you record it, it goes away, right? You cannot capture it. And so that's an additional element where I can create the sound as I'm in the space. And so that changes too, and I don't know, it creates like this additional layer, I feel, rather than having everything static. I was considering doing something like that with visuals as well, but I don't know, it's a little complicated to, there's so much that's involved with, trying to measure myself and the projection and all that, and it's just, I'm like, is it worth the headache? Because, a lot of times I also find that with, with technology, that someone can make something, and they use, this very complex, systems and programming and, machinery, and then at the end it's like, did you really need all that? Because it didn't add anything. It just it created a headache, essentially. So I'm like, is it worth the headache? Is it not worth it? So far, it has not been worth the headache, but once it will be, I'll use it. Because I really love, trying new things. And, and putting myself also in the not so comfortable situations. And especially with performance, I mean, I feel that the level of respect to performance went tremendously up for me once I stepped on the stage, for sure.
Are there any more questions? Let's just do one more.
So the trailer for your performance,
Yes.
I guess on Monday,
Mm-hmm.
you showed off some really cool illusions where you, as a performer, like interacted with the animations going on behind you. I was wondering if you could talk about the process behind that, maybe like what worked, what didn't, how you discovered like how you could utilize that aspect of performance, because it seemed very complicated.
Yeah, and a lot of it's thrown away, right? A lot of things I do, it's not like I do stuff, and then animation takes so long, especially this, painted animations. Like, and then, like, not using 1 minute is painful. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of trial and error and seeing what I can do and what works, where I can be. So the way I do things, right? I create the animation, then I put myself there, and then I, kind of see the relationship and what are the things that are possible. Then I change the animation. And then also I can change where I am, the timings and all that. And what's also interesting that as I work with the projections, I start understanding my visuals differently too. All of a sudden they come up with a new meaning themselves almost, like, oh, this doodle I did, actually means something else, like it represents, whatever. So, or, the character will be something I thought insignificant will be this godlike character, So it's, I don't really predetermine things. I sort of go along and I let things evolve, and then I sort of see how, what these things that I'm creating, what they're trying to communicate to me. So I kind of project that onto them, and then, keep working on it until it all makes sense at the end. Yep.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much.